Night at 9 on NJN.
This is our tapestry of people of many races and cultures from all over the world, all woven together. But some of us fail to acknowledge, sometimes we even deny that we have African roots. Many light-skinned Latinos have tried to block out their African ancestry. Some have even been known to hide their darker-skinned relatives. And those who question the ones who hide their racial background are always asking the same question. And your grandmother, where is she? ¿Y tu abuela, dónde está? And so to find out where some of us have been hiding our grandmothers, we have convened a panel of experts on the African ancestry of Latino Americans. Dr. Marta Moreno Vega is the founder and president of New York's Caribbean Cultural Center. Evelyn Laurent is director of Taller Puertorriqueño Bookstore in Philadelphia. Victor Vega is professor and counselor at Middlesex County College. Hector Bonilla is a senior admissions officer for undergraduates at Rutgers University. And Maria Alvarez is a state coordinator for the New Jersey Federation of Black Charities. Welcome all to the program. It's a pleasure having you here.
Thank you.
Tell me about your experiences as Black Latinos. What does that mean? Let's go around the block here. Marta, let's start with you.
Well, it means when 13 million Africans, more than 13 million Africans, were forcibly taken out of Africa and spread throughout the Americas, it left a legacy in what people call the New World of African peoples and their descendants. And my descendants were taken to Puerto Rico, and then my parents came to New York City. And what you have is a significant number of African descendants from Latin America and Central America settling in New York City and throughout the United States. And what it is that the United States is so used to the Black, African American, white equation and discussion of race that we remain invisible in terms of the contributions and the number of Africans that exist throughout Latin America, that in fact are a larger number than the African population within the United States. If you look at Brazil alone, Brazil is the largest country with African descendants in the Americas.
Evelyn?
Well, I was born in Venezuela. My family came through Haiti, so that's how the diaspora in that case worked out. To me, it's basically has been the sad part to continue rediscovering how has been the denial of our Black ancestry in Latin American history. First it started, I guess, in Venezuela, as growing up as a child, as a teenager, and then coming here, it kind of get exacerbated because I find that most of the Latinos never think I'm a Latina. So it's a constant having to say, hey, wait a second, I'm Latina, and where are you come from that you don't think I'm Latina too?
Please.
Arsenio Rodriguez wrote a song that related to que el mismo para el negro en Oriente, que en Carolina, que la 111 la Quinta Avenida. It turns out my father comes from Oriente de Cuba, my mother comes from Carolina, Puerto Rico, and I was from Harlem, 111th Street, in la Quinta Avenida. And I found that the situation for my family, whether they came from Cuba or Puerto Rico, or a Honduran grandfather, is that for Black people, it's the same thing wherever you go. Both of my grandmothers were domestics, even though they came from two different nations. And I'm concerned about the role that continues to be assigned to Black people in Latin America and also in the United States.
Maria?
Yeah, I think that, like Evelyn, I think the issue is always trying to prove to your Latino, quote-unquote, brothers and sisters that you also share some of that heritage. Of course, my experience really goes to Cuba. I was born in Cuba. My grandparents migrated to Cuba, of course, from Jamaica at different times. And of course, my parents were born in Cuba and so on and so forth. Also, as Hector indicated, that there is a continuous denial or actually an invisibility of our history as Blacks in the Americas. In modern day, of course, United States, and also in all the parts of Latin America. And we see that in the media, and we see that all over.
Okay, Victor.
Yeah, to follow along Y tu abuela donde está by Fortunado Vizcarrondo, you know, in speaking about Blackness, my grandparents are from the Santurce region in Puerto Rico. I'm a Santurce-born Puerto Rican also. My mother migrated over to the United States with me and my brother, and I'm very proud to say that, you know, she maintained a legacy coming out of Santurce that was very centered in the sense of Africa. You know, that became part of my legacy primarily through hearing her singing songs from Santurce, always reminding us of the music and the dance. And as a Latino African or a person of that descendancy, you know, I think what we bring as a people, you know, in terms of contributions has a lot to offer in terms of knowledge, in terms of the aesthetics that we offer to the world, also in terms of our values as families and parents, and then also in terms of, you know, how we see ourselves as a people in terms of our blackness. So, you know, I think that's what the whole notion of being black and being Latino means to me as a Santurce.
One of the things that I want to explore here today is how you folks relate to not only Americans who don't understand what it is to be a Latino, first of all, many times, and then a black Latino even less, but also how you relate to other Latinos, because there are situations in the Latino community where you find yourself, I mean, I recently wrote a column about this races. And one of the things that, you know, I said in this column is that you go to the corner bodega and you overhear somebody say in Spanish, well, so-and-so has pelo malo, bad hair. You know, nothing happens. You're used to hearing it sometimes. But if you heard the same phrase in English, your politically correct antenna would go up and say, what do you mean somebody has black hair? What is that saying? So, I mean, how do you deal with the existence of racism even in the Latino community?
Well, my response was developing an organization 20 years ago, because remember I directed El Museo del Barrio, and out of that experience we did an exhibition on the African traditions of Puerto Rico, and when we showed photographs of Loíza and Bélgica and Ponce, our own community reacted and said, no, you did not take those photos in Puerto Rico, impossible. And that made a light go on, you know, and I mean, clearly, personally, I had gone through racist experiences, you know, within our community and outside the community. But that sort of brought to light the need to have a place where you could have educational information available, where you could have images and traditions and aesthetic and sacredness that speaks to the African traditions that we bring as a people. Which
is what your Caribbean Cultural Center has been about for, what, 20 years?
For 20 years, yeah. And I think that it also entered the dialogue in a different frame, that the diversity that we bring. And as he was saying, that we bring an aesthetic that's different, that we bring traditions, that African beliefs have survived in Latin America in almost pure form, in Brazil, in Cuba, in Haiti, Trinidad, so that we have within our cultures a reservoir of information that the rest of the world needs to piece together the history and the experiences of Africans in the world.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think for me, I do a lot of lectures in different colleges, and you got to open up a historical dialogue with a lot of young people, because they have to understand, you know, how a lot of the conditions were created in terms of, you know, concepts and ideas. Basically, it's a rhetorical response, and how was that rhetorical response created, and by whom was it created? And more importantly, what do you do to change it if you really are interested in empowering yourselves as a people and respecting yourselves as a people? I mean, we use the word dignidad, you know, in our culture, largely to speak about, you know, how we treat each other in terms of values, you know, and how we hold each other together as a people. So I think, you know, you have to start addressing those themes that are racist in nature by actually opening up a dialogue and showing people how the origin and the role of those things play in terms of our own conceptualization.
But the dialogue also has to be started not just with white people, white Latinos or white Americans, but also with Latino, African Latinos as well, because some of them don't recognize that they're even black. I mean, have you ever been asked if you're really, do you think you're black?
Of course.
Yes, absolutely.
And you look black, but you're still, there are other Latinos who may not think you're black, or they may not think themselves as black. Is that happening?
Yeah, well, I wanted to say within the same context as Marta is describing, Taller Puertorriqueño has been addressing this issue for a long time, and recently, actually this February, we started our first Arturo Chamber series event, which this year and the following years are going to address, first of all, the legacy of Arturo Chamber, who was a scholar searching for Pan-African achievement all over the world, and he was a Puerto Rican. And secondly, trying then with that, first of all, develop, research, and acknowledge our African presence, culture in our presence in our culture, and trying to bridge further up between Latin Americans and African Americans. And in addition to that, since I work in the bookstore, I deal with people constantly, and almost every single person who works in the bookstore never think I'm Latina. So it's always a dialogue of, well, having to explain, first of all, yes, I'm Venezuelan, I'm Latina. And normally I confront, why didn't you think I was Latina? And there's a whole discussion that normally leads to an education process of every single person that comes in there. I also do it on a personal level, day to day.
But how do you deal with black Latinos who refuse to accept that they're black, who think that they are actually white?
Well, it's an educational process. We have to understand that we all come from colonial realities. And the educational systems that were implanted in our colonial realities, including the United States, excluded the experience of Africans, excluded the experience of Native and Asian cultures. So that what you're really dealing with throughout the world has been a white supremacist point of view of history that excludes the major part of the world. So that our people are the products of that as well, as United States-born whites are the product of that as well. And you have to sort of deconstruct that notion of what is black and what is white. Does pigmentation only make you black? That's part of it. What do you practice? What do you do? What do you eat? Si come mondongo, si come mofongo, those are African words, you know what I mean? So that with children, we get that very basic in terms of the foods you eat, the rhythms that you dance to, the images that you celebrate, as well as the reality that pigmentation or the melanin in your skin causes reactions within this society and throughout the world.
I also believe that that there's a sense in the Latin American community of nationalism, which is one thing, and so therefore we're basically put together under this umbrella called nationalism.
Yeah, I'm not, in your case, someone would say, I'm not black, I'm Cuban.
Right, exactly. And that's where the division occurs, because then therefore the answer becomes, well, what really unites us? What is it that we have in common as Latino? Is it only the language? And that may be a big factor. That may be the only thing that we have in common. That we have this language that certainly, for lack of a better term, was inherited through our Spaniards, that the Spanish colonists. However, what really comes to point here is that once that division occurs, once we start to recognize that, there's certainly a difference between you and me. If the only thing that unites us is just language, then there's definitely a lack of education, because there's more to it than that. It has to do with culture, and it does have to do with not just skin pigmentation. It has to do with a whole concept of thought, practices, ethnicities that make up, our how would I say, our labels as Black Latinos.
Just last year in the Dominican Republic, you had a race for president between two candidates. One was lighter skinned than the other, but by American standards, they would both be considered black. But race, the so-called race card was played in this political campaign, because the people who were against Peña Gomez, who was the darker of the two, were accusing him of being Haitian. So we have a major problem in the Dominican and in the Latino community as a whole, where it's this racism based on shades, not just black and white as it is in the United States. We have many more shades of color in between that we define. One at a time. Okay.
No, I'm sorry.
And I say something. I think that some issues that I keep on harping on is that black people keep on being denied in the histories of Latin America. I'll say Puerto Rico is one of the best examples, but so is the Dominican Republic, and so was Cuba, and so was Colombia, and so was Venezuela. All right, just May 3rd, black people in Loíza were celebrating the 200th anniversary of the defeat of the British fleet and British army that came to Puerto Rico. You cannot find that in too many Puerto Rican history books, and it's clearly not celebrating any of the Puerto Rican studies departments in New York City or in New Jersey. So we have to begin to start including us in history, because we have participated in the history of every Latin American nation, at least in the Caribbean.
Absolutely.
I think that you also have, I think you have to look at the legal structures of the various countries. In the United States, if you have a drop of black blood, you're black. In Latin America, the legal structure allowed for honorary whites, that is, blancamiento, you know, adelantando la raza. The whiter you got, you know, you could sort of fit in as a mulatto. In the case of Santo Domingo, a light-skinned Indian.
Well, you still find
see
people.
what I'm saying?
You still find people here now who will say they want to marry a lighter-skinned person because they want to better the race.
Because this is the baggage we bring. This is the baggage we bring from our Latin American countries. And the reality is that if you're very light-skinned in Puerto Rico or in Cuba, still, or in Venezuela, you have a better chance of being employed. The same thing is in the United States. But in the United States, the definition for you would be African American. And in our countries, it would be trigueña, mulatica, café con leche, you know, so that we have developed a series of categories of getting to whiteness.
And it really speaks to the depth of our the problem, which is our psychology and our psyche, in terms of how we want to see ourselves in terms of a cultural identity. For the most part, you know, because we have all those categories of colors, you know, we buy into different values by placing ourselves or having been placed in each of those categories, whether it be, you know, retinto, mulatto, grifo, lo que sea. You know, we're rewarded in those categories a particular way, historically.
By the colonial powers.
Right, by the colonial powers. And so now our psychology is so bent into accepting those values that now we have to do a reconstruction of those values in order to be able to get a self-empowerment of recognizing that we can still see ourselves as, you know, sons and daughters of Africa and still be able to contribute things within the context of those categories, but still placing Africa as the dominant value over all those categories.
And then based on the shade of your skin in some countries in Latin America, that determines what a position you're going to get, what kind of a job you're going to hold. In Peru, for example, I think we have a clip that we're going to show up of a picture of pallbearers in funerals in Peru are almost all black. There are positions reserved at the bottom of the scale, of course, for black people in certain Latin American countries, doormen.
Also in the U.S., you know, also in the U.S. I mean, we have to realize that what happens in Latin America is duplicated in the U.S. under different terms. Throughout the world, white supremacy, imperialism, colonialism establish a structure that is the same. And we have to also understand the reality that if a light-skinned Latino comes to the U.S., he has privilege. And in his country, he has privilege. But here, he's considered a minority. So let's say a person who is an oppressor, and Spaniards were oppressors and they speak Spanish, you know, and of course they forget the Moorish occupation of Spain for 1,000 years, but let's leave that one aside. When a person of privilege who is an oppressor in his own country in Latin America comes to the U.S., they're defined as a minority and given a privileged position here over darker skinned Latinos. So that it's far more intricate, you know what I mean, than just saying, well, this happens in Latin America. It also happens within the U.S.
Yeah. I was going just to add that I read last year that in Ecuador, for instance, black women were discouraged to follow careers into TV or advertising or news broadcasting because they were too ugly to be considered for TV. And that's a statement that you hear throughout also Latin America, that blacks equate to ugliness. Therefore, you have to improve yourself by whitening yourself. But I wanted to add that has to do a lot with the evolutionary history of our colonial past, that for Spain, and that you have to differentiate it with the Saxon. For Spain, you had hope if you would improve your race, become more white. Therefore, you were accepted if you have some drop of white. And the more you had, the more you permeate into society and you were accepted into that. And that's very, very much ingrained into our psyche, and it has a lot to do with our values and the way we divide and the way we qualify beauty and intelligence.
I think there was a question that going back to your original question, which was, how do you deal with being a Black Latino and white and other Latinos? And what's interesting is that as a Black Latino, I think that there's also a tendency of assimilating where in a group or within a group that you can identify with visually, basically. So certainly another reason why, there are certainly Black Latinos. At times, it's difficult for us to know where they are, and that could be a primary reason for that, where we somewhat assimilate within a group that looks like us. We might speak a different language, but that's neither here or there. What's important is our cultural and the fact that we are able to identify ourselves by a culture, and that's really the link.
Mm-hmm. When someone who's not really your friend, but just an acquaintance says to you, "Hi, negrita, ¿cómo tú estás?" Is that offensive? Or "Hi, negrito," or "negrito"? They mean it in a loving kind of way most of the time, but do they?
We've been educated.
Or do they?
We've been educated.
Well, the concept of negrito, mulatto, again, I always go back to the historical origination of those terms. They came out of a racist nomenclature. They came out of someone who was stipulating you under these categories because they wanted to put you within an inferior system, or for you to buy into the hype of an inferior system. You have to let people know that that all comes as part and parcel of a false consciousness. People are not, in a reality. And so now either you accept it as such in the culture, or you re-educate people to say what they need to be saying so it's acceptable to you as an individual.
What's the difference between saying in the African American community being called boy as being called negrito or negrita? All right, you're essentially making somebody less than you are. All right, and that did not start in the United States. That actually came from Latin America, where the first Africans were enslaved.
I normally say, will you be called somebody else blanquita, chinita, rubiecita? That doesn't happen. Therefore, why it has to be negrita? I have a name, and I love my name. So of course, there are people who will come and say that, people who know me and people who don't know me, but normally I try to say, please, I have a name and I like my name.
Most people that know me now will say, "Mira, santuseño." So they'll call me in accordance to the region now, as opposed to, negro.
We've mentioned Arturo Schomburg, but there's a legacy of contributions by African Latinos, not only to this country, but to the world. And I can't think of anyone better than Marta Vega to just tell us a little bit about them and what those contributions are. We have about 2 or 3 minutes left in the program, but I want to end on a positive note. I mean, America should know that, fill in the blank.
Oh, let's look at some people contemporary who I think have done incredible work. Mario Bauzá, Frank Grillo, Celia Cruz, Emeterio Betance, Eugenio María de Hostos, Nicolás Guillén,
I would just add the narrative, Latin American narrative in general. Our narrative, our richness in our narrative, I believe it has a lot of element from African narrative.
Can I speak? As a story,
Piri Thomas.
You have Piri
we have to go
Thomas.
back even further. Cuban Revolution, Gualberto Gómez, Sotero Figueroa, Los Mambises,
Maceo,
Independence movement from the beginning of Latin America.
All the independence movement were actually started by struggles of Black people. We go back.
But then again, is the problem the fact that a lot of our young people, those who are denying their African ancestry, perhaps they don't know that they have these people as role models?
Absolutely.
I think the
And
dialogue
what needs to be done to
still,
instruct them?
I think the dialogue still has to happen, and I think that this group has started a dialogue, and I think that maybe Evelyn should talk about what happened on Saturday, where a group of Afro-Latinos came together to discuss the dialogue that needs to happen going into the third millennium.
I think we have less than 1 minute, but please do it, Evelyn.
Many of us who are interested in searching for improvement and for the recognition of the African legacy in Latin American history and culture got together. We had an amazing meeting, and we are trying to propose a series of action to be taken within the Latino community and all Latin America to try to rewrite history where the African people who have a place and have documented what have been done so far in our culture and history.
And all of you participated in this meeting?
All of us were invited. Some of us went, some of us couldn't. And there's also a movement coming out of Uruguay, Este Mundo Afro, where 250 black-based organizations in Latin America and Central America have gotten together. And the whole notion is to re-educate, to develop a movement of the African presence in Latin America and the contributions, and also the restructuring of political and economic systems and social systems that have to occur to place our communities at equal footing with all other communities.
Mm-hmm. And then again, we always have the Caribbean Cultural Center as the resource center in Manhattan.
Thank you.
To turn to and for information and guidance and all the workshops and panels that may be coming up. The Caribbean Cultural Center has always been my reference, my reference source for everything that's happening. It's really a pleasure. It's been a wonderful experience having all of you on the program. I wish we would have had 3 more of these half hours because there's much more that we could have discussed. And maybe hopefully in the near future when one of your conferences is going on, you'll invite Imágenes. We'll come out with our cameras and we'll take it from there.
Maybe for September, the Hispanic month.
Sounds good. I'm Miguel Perez, and I'll see you next week. I hope I'll see you next week on another edition of Imágenes. Hasta pronto.